On Saturn V, there was a window of time where the rocket was not allowed to do the one thing every sane engineer would want it to do in an emergency: shut down. Not because shutting down was hard, not because the engines couldn't respond, but because shutting down too early could be worse than the failure itself. For the first 30 seconds after liftoff, Saturn V lived inside a brutal constraint. If something went wrong, if guidance went unstable, if the vehicle began to diverge, if the flight path turned dangerous, there were cases where the safety system would detect it and still refuse to kill the engines. Because down low, close to the pad, engine cutoff didn't mean safe. It meant fallback. It meant a fully fueled launch vehicle losing thrust while it still carried enough propellant to erase Launch Complex 39 from the map. So NASA built a launch system with a paradox at its heart. In the one moment where the rocket is closest to people, structures, and ground infrastructure, the vehicle's automatic logic is forced to keep pushing, even if the rocket is no longer flying correctly, even if it has already begun to die. This is the story of the most unforgiving rule Saturn V ever lived under: the first 30 seconds, the period where the rocket was not allowed to fail because it was not allowed to stop. We tend to imagine liftoff as a clean transition. Engines ignite, the vehicle rises, the tower drops away, the mission begins. But physically, Saturn V starts life in a condition that is almost the opposite of flying. At liftoff, it weighs roughly 2.8 million kilograms, about 6.2 million pounds, and it has about 34 meganewtons of thrust, about 7.5 million pounds force, spread across 5 F1 engines. That's only a modest thrust-to-weight margin. At the instant of first motion, Saturn V is not leaping off the pad. It is just barely winning an argument with gravity. And that matters because in those early seconds, the rocket doesn't have altitude as a safety resource. It doesn't have time. It doesn't have space. It doesn't have options. The pad is still under it. The tower is still beside it. The flame trench is still below. So the first job of Saturn V is not to accelerate. It is simply this: stay moving. Because if Saturn V loses thrust too early, it doesn't drift harmlessly back down. It falls back into the launch complex while still full of propellant. And NASA understood that outcome so well that it shaped the logic of the entire abort architecture. Pad fallback is not a dramatic phrase, but the event it describes is one of the worst physical disasters you can engineer into a launch vehicle. A Saturn V at liftoff is a vertical storage tank farm. Thousands of tons of liquid oxygen and RP-1 in the S-1C. Thousands of tons of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen in the S-2. More in the S-4B. If thrust is lost while the vehicle is still low and still close to the pad, the failure is no longer just vehicle loss. It becomes an explosion in the launch area. And that is exactly why Saturn V had a rule that seems insane on paper. For the first 30 seconds of flight, the abort logic would not shut down the engines in the normal abort sequence. In Boeing's Saturn V abort and malfunction analysis documents, this is described very directly. Before 30 seconds, the engines are not shut down in the abort sequence, and certain failures can turn the vehicle and cause an impact in the pad area. So this is the core truth. Down low, it's possible to be in an emergency where the correct action is not to shut down. The correct action is to keep flying long enough to move the disaster away from the ground infrastructure. That is not a moral decision, it's a geometry decision.
If you want to understand how Saturn V survived, you have to forget the modern idea that the computer handles abort logic. Apollo-era engineering did not trust a single digital system to carry crew survival. Saturn V's safety logic was distributed: hardwired comparators, relays, diode logic, inhibit circuits, discrete signals, and this system had a name: the Emergency Detection System, EDS. EDS was designed to detect conditions that could destroy the vehicle so fast that a human crew could not respond in time. And the EDS could do more than light a warning. It could command an abort sequence. But EDS did not have unlimited authority all the time. It had modes, inhibits, time windows. Because some correct abort actions at one moment become catastrophic at another, especially right after liftoff.
Imagine the most basic emergency. The rocket is unstable. It's rotating too fast, or it's diverging off the intended attitude. The natural response is stop thrust, stop propulsion, stop motion. But if Saturn V shuts down thrust too early, you are left with a fully fueled vehicle that is no longer under control and no longer climbing. Now it's falling. And if it falls far enough, it falls back into the pad region. So NASA made a decision that sounds brutal but is technically rational. In the first 30 seconds, the system prioritizes getting away from the pad over executing a clean engine shutdown. You can see this logic reflected again and again in the failure analyses. Certain attitude failures before 30 seconds can produce pad area impacts because the normal abort sequence does not shut down the engines before that point. That single detail tells you everything. The first 30 seconds are not about abort. They are about escape from the launch complex, even if the escape is ugly, even if the rocket is already sick. There is another reason the early window is so unforgiving. There are failure times so early that nothing is survivable. In the same abort analysis work, there is a stark line. Failures prior to roughly 1.2 seconds can result in engines colliding with hold-down posts. Crew loss is assumed because there are no valid cues in that instant. This is the cliff edge of liftoff physics. Before the vehicle is cleanly clear of its constraints, there are situations where there is no safe escape, no clean abort, no time to detect, decide, and act. The rocket has not yet entered free flight. It is still becoming a moving object. So the first seconds are not a controlled flight regime. They are a transition regime, and the logic that governs them must be designed around the worst geometry. Apollo crews had a manual launch escape system abort handle, a physical control that could initiate a sequence, command cutoff signals to the launch vehicle, start command module separation, fire the escape motors, and trigger post-abort sequencing. But even the crew's manual system had constraints. In the AS-507 operational abort analysis, the ALES abort description includes a line most people miss. Engine cutoff from the spacecraft is inhibited during the first 30 seconds of flight. That is extraordinary. It means that even if the crew initiates an ALES abort sequence in that early period, the architecture is designed to prevent a clean kill-the-rocket action in the most dangerous low-altitude window. The goal is the same as the automatic logic. Don't create a dead rocket that can fall back into the pad area. This is not about saving hardware. It's about preventing a catastrophe that spreads. Even if the engines are running correctly, the vehicle still must clear obstacles. During the earliest seconds, Saturn V is climbing slowly and steering carefully. The tower is beside it. The umbilical arms have just swung away. The structure is still near fixed infrastructure, so the rocket is not free, not yet. This is why the early guidance and control regime is extremely conservative. It is also why many abort options are not symmetrical. A clean abort at altitude might mean cut engines, separate, escape. But down low, a clean abort can create a different disaster. The rocket falls back with a still attached propellant stack. So instead of a tidy termination, you get a falling fuel complex. So what exactly does 30 seconds mean here? It is not a poetic number. It is a designed threshold, a timer-based inhibit window that changes the authority of shutdown and abort actions. In the Saturn V abort analysis, the 30-second mark shows up as a hard boundary in multiple places. It explicitly states that engine cutoff from the spacecraft is inhibited during the first 30 seconds. And it also describes the consequences of failures in that regime. Engines are not shut down before 30 seconds, so certain malfunctions can cause pad area impact. So this is not a general early flight is risky statement. This is engineered logic. The safety system is different at t plus 29 seconds than it is at t plus 31 seconds. And the reason is simple. At 30 seconds, the geometry is finally starting to shift. The rocket is higher. The energy is higher. The distance from the pad is larger. Now shutdown begins to look like an option instead of a guaranteed disaster. Here's where Saturn V becomes intellectually terrifying. We often say a failure, like it's a binary event. But in this window, there are different kinds of failure, and they have very different consequences. An engine can fail, a sensor can fail, a control signal can saturate, a guidance loop can produce an attitude error that drives actuators hard over. And not all of these look the same to the system. Some are slow enough to be diagnosed, some are fast enough to be catastrophic, and some are the worst kind, failures that don't remove thrust, they corrupt control. Because thrust without control is not power, it is a weapon pointed randomly. One of the most revealing sections in the malfunction analysis deals with what it calls a saturated attitude error signal, a failure that causes the control system to see a huge attitude error driving a hard response. The analysis explains the consequence brutally. Because engines are not shut down in the abort sequence before 30 seconds, a saturated attitude error can turn the vehicle and cause it to impact in the pad area. That's the nightmare. Not an engine exploding, not a single turbopump failure. A control law believing something that isn't true and steering the rocket into the ground. And the tragedy is that even if abort logic triggers, the inhibited shutdown behavior can preserve thrust long enough for the rocket to become a moving projectile in the launch area. So the rule doesn't make you safe. It merely prevents one specific catastrophe, a clean cutoff and fallback. It trades that risk for others. Because in the first 30 seconds, there are no perfect choices. Only choices that move the odds. People assume the earliest seconds are the worst, but the failure analysis points to a different truth. When it discusses abort lead times for saturated attitude error malfunctions, it calls out the most critical period of flight as from 30 seconds to 90 seconds. That statement is loaded. It means once you get past the purely geometric constraints of the pad area, you enter a window where
You're high enough to avoid immediate pad catastrophe, but not high enough to guarantee survival. And you're fast enough that structural breakup can happen violently. So the 30-second inhibit does not end danger. It ends one kind of danger, and it hands the mission to a different kind.
Now we get to one of the most unsettling lines in the entire analysis. It states that if an explosion occurs 1 second after breakup, the crew would be unsafe from explosions following aborts occurring between about 30 and 65 seconds. Read that again. Even after the inhibit window, and even with an abort, there exists a time band where the crew might still not survive, depending on when breakup and explosion occur relative to the abort sequence. This is what "launch is dangerous" actually means when written by the engineers who had to quantify it. It means there are windows where no architecture guarantees survival. You can improve odds, you can shape risk, but you cannot delete physics. So why would NASA tolerate a design where the rocket cannot be cleanly shut down in the first 30 seconds? Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is giving the safety system authority to shut the rocket off low and then watching a fully fueled Saturn V fall back into the launch complex. NASA did not build Saturn V to be safe. They built it to be survivable enough to operate. That sounds harsh, but it's the reality of crewed heavy lift in that era. The vehicle's first job is to climb. The second job is to steer, and only once it has enough altitude does terminate thrust become a safer option than keep going. That is what the 30-second line represents, a change in which failure mode kills you. There is another reason these inhibits existed: false aborts. If your emergency system is too sensitive, it aborts when it shouldn't. Abort too early and you can create a disaster. Abort too late and you may lose the crew. So EDS had to be tough, and it had to avoid being fooled. That's why it used hardware thresholds, rate limits, and discrete queue logic. It wasn't designed to think. It was designed to judge only a small number of conditions extremely reliably. And even then, the analysis work shows how narrow the margins could be. In the saturated attitude error case, for example, the vehicle rate limits can approach the EDS rate threshold without exceeding it, creating marginal queue conditions and reliance on other queues. That's not cinematic. That's what real reliability looks like: a system operating near thresholds because the environment forces it there. Most viewers assume engine out equals abort. On Saturn V, that's not how the vehicle was designed. The S1C stage could lose a single F1 engine and still keep going, depending on the time and vehicle state. The vehicle's structural loads, guidance authority, and performance plateau mattered more than the fact of a single engine failure. The scary scenario is not one engine out. The scary scenario is multiple engines out too early, or a failure that produces control loss, or a sensor failure that forces a wrong decision. And that's why the 30-second rule is so important, because in those first moments, even the correct reaction to a failure can create an unacceptable ground hazard. So NASA's logic does something counterintuitive. It treats early engine cutoff as a danger in itself.
So what is this period, really? It is a controlled gamble engineered into the launch vehicle. For 30 seconds, the safety architecture is built around one objective: do not create pad fallback. Even if that means continuing thrust in conditions where you would normally want to shut down. Even if that means accepting that some malfunctions can steer the vehicle into the pad area. Even if that means manual engine cutoff commands from the spacecraft are inhibited. This is not a mistake, it is a deliberate trade, and it defines what Saturn V was. Not a rocket that prevented failure, a rocket that tried to keep failure from happening where it would destroy everyone else too. Once the inhibit expires, the safety system gains more authority. Now the vehicle is far enough away that engine shutdown is no longer an automatic ground catastrophe. Now an abort can create separation and dispersal rather than fallback. But the analysis shows that even after this point, risk remains deeply time-dependent. The most critical interval extends beyond 30 seconds. And the unsafe from explosion abort band runs into the 30 to 65-second region in certain breakup scenarios. So, if you're looking for the moment where Saturn V becomes safe, you won't find it. You'll find only moments where different survival paths become possible. This entire architecture reveals something modern audiences often miss. Apollo was not built under the assumption that computers solve problems. Apollo was built under the assumption that problems happen too fast. So, the system had to respond with hardware logic, timed inhibits, and carefully bounded authority. But the deeper truth is even sharper. Apollo was engineered around the reality that some phases of flight cannot be made safe in the ordinary sense. They can only be made survivable enough to attempt, and the first 30 seconds of Saturn V is the cleanest example, because it is the moment where the vehicle's emergency logic is forced to refuse the obvious action, to prevent an even worse catastrophe.
Saturn V's greatest triumph was not that it was powerful. It was that it was engineered to survive a world where perfect safety did not exist. In the first 30 seconds, Saturn V is not allowed to fail, because it is not allowed to stop. That rule is not drama. It's the geometry of a 110-meter rocket lifting off a pad beside a tower loaded with millions of pounds of propellant with only a narrow margin above gravity. And once you see it that way, you realize something unsettling. Apollo didn't reach the moon because it was safe. Apollo reached the moon because the engineers knew exactly where it was unsafe, and they built logic that could survive that reality. Even if it meant the rocket had to keep flying when every instinct says it should shut down. Because in that first half minute, the most dangerous thing Saturn V could ever become was a rocket that stopped. If you want to see what Saturn V had to survive before that 30-second window even began, start with the systems that had to work while the rocket was still chained to the pad. Watch the final 3 minutes before Saturn V liftoff. Then continue with the first 10 seconds after liftoff, where the vehicle faced its earliest structural and control risks while it was still boxed in by the tower and the pad geometry. And if you enjoy these deep technical breakdowns, help the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who still thinks liftoff is the easy part.